Let's start out today. We'll start with a small amount of the Indian yellow.
We don't make mistakes, just happy little accidents. The Joy of Painting wasn't supposed to be legendary. It was a quiet PBS show about a soft-spoken man painting trees in 30 minutes. No drama, no conflict, just Bob Ross, his brushes, and those happy little clouds. But behind that afro and that soothing voice, nothing was peaceful. Bob Ross was a retired military drill sergeant who hated yelling. The afro was a perm he despised but couldn't change. And his business partners betrayed him so badly, it destroyed his family. These are 20 secrets about the joy of painting hidden for decades. And trust me, the bonus fact will break your heart. Let's paint some happy little truths. Fact 20. Bob Ross was a master sergeant in the Air Force who screamed at people for 20 years and created his gentle persona as deliberate opposite Bob in military.
A nice way of making just a gorgeous little painting that's very simple.
Here's something that will shatter your image of Bob Ross. Before he became the softest voice on television, Bob Ross was a United States Air Force Master Sergeant who spent 20 years yelling at subordinates daily. Ross enlisted in 1961 at age 18. He rose through ranks quickly due to his intensity and commanding presence. His job required him to discipline airmen and maintain order through intimidation. Ross later said he screamed so much his throat hurt constantly. He hated who he'd become. The military demanded aggression. Ross felt himself disappearing beneath the anger. When he retired from the Air Force in 1981 at age 38, he made a vow. He would never scream at another person again. The gentle whisper voice on The Joy of Painting wasn't natural. It was Bob Ross deliberately overcompensating for 2 decades of military aggression. Friends from his military days said they didn't recognize the man on television. That's not Bob, they'd say, but it was Bob. The real Bob he'd buried beneath military requirements for 20 years. The Joy of Painting became Ross's therapy and rebellion against everything the military had forced him to become. Every gentle word was an apology for years of screaming. Fact 19. The iconic afro was a perm. Bob Ross got to save money on haircuts and he hated it but couldn't change it. Once the show became popular, permed versus afro.
Hey, glad you could join me today. You ready to do a fantastic little painting? Well, good. Tell you what, let's have a...
Bob Ross's legendary afro was a complete accident born from poverty, and he despised it for the rest of his life. In the late 1970s, Ross was broke, working as a bartender and selling paintings at malls. Haircuts cost money he didn't have. His girlfriend suggested getting a perm. Permed hair required less maintenance and fewer salon visits. Ross agreed purely for financial reasons. The perm gave him a massive curly afro. Ross thought it looked ridiculous, but people noticed it. The hair made him memorable at art shows. When The Joy of Painting started filming in 1983, producers loved the afro. It made Bob visually distinctive on camera. The hair became part of his brand immediately. Ross wanted to cut it off after season 1. Producers told him absolutely not. The afro was iconic. Merchandise featured it. Children recognized him because of it. Ross was trapped by his own hair. He later told his son he was so tired of the perm, he wanted to shave his head completely, but he couldn't. The afro had become bigger than Bob Ross the person. He maintained that perm until his death, hating every moment. The hair that defined him was something he never wanted in the first place. Fact 18. Bob Ross completed over 30,000 paintings in his lifetime, but refused to sell any of them and gave most away for free.
Hello, I'm Bob Ross. I'd like to welcome you to The Joy of Painting. This is a...
And Bob was generally into helping out.
Bob Ross painted obsessively and gave nearly everything away, which seems generous until you understand the dark business reason behind it. Ross completed an estimated 30,000 plus paintings during his career. 3 versions of every Joy of Painting episode. 1 painted beforehand for reference, 1 during filming, 1 afterward for photographs. That's over 1,000 paintings from the show alone. Plus, thousands more he painted for practice, demonstrations, and personal joy. People constantly offered to buy Ross's work. He always refused. Not for sale, he'd say. Instead, he donated paintings to PBS stations for fundraisers. He gave them to friends, strangers, anyone who asked. His generosity seemed beautiful, but there was a calculated business reason. Ross made almost no money from The Joy of Painting itself. PBS paid minimally. His real income came from selling painting supplies, instructional books, and teaching certification courses. If Ross sold his paintings, he'd establish market value for his art. Once paintings had monetary worth, his business model collapsed. He needed to position himself as a teacher and supply merchant, not a fine artist. Giving paintings away for free protected his brand strategy. The generosity was genuine, but also strategic business protection. Ross understood that being seen as a gift giver rather than a seller maintained his accessible everyman image. Fact 17. The show was filmed in Muncie, Indiana, at a tiny PBS station, and Bob Ross completed each episode in real time with no editing.
This is where the magic happened.
I'll admit, I've watched tons
First of all, the main two brushes that we'll use. We have here
The joy of painting was filmed under impossibly tight constraints that made every episode a legitimate miracle. The show was produced at WIPB, a small PBS station in Muncie, Indiana. The studio was tiny with minimal equipment and budget. Ross had to complete each painting in exactly 26 minutes to fit the 30-minute broadcast slot with credits. There was no editing, no second takes, no stopping for mistakes. Ross painted in real time straight through. If he made an error, he had to incorporate it into the painting seamlessly. The pressure was enormous. Ross filmed 13 episodes per session. He'd arrive at the studio, set up, film an episode, clean up, prepare a new canvas, and immediately film another. Some days, he filmed 6 episodes consecutively. The pace was brutal. Between episodes, he had only minutes to rest. The completed paintings were still wet when carried away. Production assistants would carefully move them to drying racks without smudging. Ross never complained about the schedule. He treated it like meditation. The time constraints forced him to work intuitively without overthinking. That's why his technique looks effortless. It had to be. There was literally no time for hesitation or revision during filming. Fact 16. Bob Ross painted with a disability after losing part of his left index finger in a carpentry accident as a young man.
same thing, tiny little circles. You have a number 10 knife, which is the larger of the two.
Bob Ross painted every single Joy of Painting episode missing part of a finger, and viewers never noticed. In his early 20s, while working construction to support his family, Ross suffered a carpentry accident. A saw blade severed the top portion of his left index finger. The injury was permanent. Ross lost sensation and mobility in that finger. It affected his grip and fine motor control. Most people would consider this career ending for a professional artist. Ross adapted completely. He learned to compensate using other fingers. His painting technique evolved around the disability. The palette knife work he became famous for was partially necessity. Brushes require precise finger control. Palette knives require broader hand movements. Ross developed his signature style partially because his injured finger limited traditional brush techniques. He never discussed the disability publicly. He was embarrassed by it and wore his fingers positioned carefully on camera to hide the injury. Only close friends and family knew. Art students who studied with Ross never realized he was painting with a significant physical limitation. His ability to create beautiful art despite the disability makes his technical skill even more impressive. The happy little trees were painted by someone who'd overcome his own physical accident to keep creating. Fact 15. The painting technique Bob Ross used is called wet on wet, and he didn't invent it but learned it from a German painter named William Alexander.
Whatever he wants to show. See, I would say from here on, let the happy little river.
Cloud lives. Maybe he lives right in here. Take the corner of the brush.
Bob Ross didn't invent his painting technique. He learned it from William Alexander, and the student surpassed the teacher so dramatically it created lifelong bitterness. The wet on wet, or alla prima technique, allows painters to complete work in one session by applying wet paint directly onto wet paint without waiting for layers to dry. German painter William Alexander taught this method on his PBS show, The Magic of Oil Painting, starting in 1974. Bob Ross discovered Alexander's show while still in the Air Force. He was mesmerized. Ross traveled to meet Alexander and paid for painting lessons. Alexander recognized Ross's talent immediately and trained him as a certified instructor. Ross began teaching Alexander's method at art centers. Then Ross started The Joy of Painting in 1983. Alexander was furious. He felt Ross had stolen his technique and his show concept. The two painters never spoke again after The Joy of Painting premiered. Ross's show became massively more popular than Alexander's ever was. Alexander spent years giving bitter interviews about Ross stealing from him. Ross rarely addressed the controversy publicly. When asked, he'd credit Alexander as an influence, but insisted his teaching style and personality were his own. The truth is, Ross took Alexander's technique and made it accessible in ways Alexander never could. Alexander was technical and Germanic. Ross was warm and encouraging. Same method, completely different delivery. Fact 14. Bob Ross's business partners, Annette and Walt Kowalski, took control of his name and likeness before he died, and his family received nothing but Bob Ross. Annette and Walt Kowalski, Bob Ross. This is where the Bob Ross story becomes truly dark. Annette and Walt Kowalski befriended Bob Ross in the early 1980s and systematically seized control of his entire legacy. The Kowalskis attended one of Ross's painting classes in 1982. Annette was grieving her son's recent death. Ross's gentle teaching helped her heal. The Kowalskis saw business potential and proposed partnership. They'd help Ross build a brand. Together, they founded Bob Ross Inc. in 1985. The company would sell painting supplies, books, and teaching certifications. Ross trusted them completely. The partnership agreement gave the Kowalskis controlling interest. Ross was too naive to understand what he'd signed. As The Joy of Painting grew popular, the Kowalskis tightened their grip. They registered trademarks for Bob Ross's name and likeness. When Ross became ill with lymphoma in 1994, the Kowalskis made their move. They convinced the dying Ross to sign away rights to his name, image, and likeness in perpetuity. Ross's family was devastated. After his death in 1995, the Kowalskis owned everything. Ross's son Steve and his surviving family received no profits from Bob Ross Inc. All merchandise, streaming rights, and licensing deals enriched the Kowalskis while Ross's family struggled financially. The gentle painter who gave away his art was exploited by the people he trusted most. Fact 13. Bob Ross hosted The Joy of Painting for free during early seasons and made his money, selling paint supplies and teaching workshops.
Trees and roads and stones, rocks, houses, it's unreal what you can do with those son of a gun.
Trees, right? But really, if you kind of close your eyes and visualize,
Bob Ross barely made any money from The Joy of Painting itself, which seems insane until you understand PBS economics and his business model. PBS stations operate on donations and grants. They pay hosts minimally or not at all. Ross hosted the show for free during early seasons, viewing it as extended advertising for his real business. His income came from Bob Ross Inc., selling painting supplies, how-to books, and teaching certification courses. Every episode was essentially a 30-minute commercial for his products. When Ross painted with specific brushes or palette knives, he'd mention the tools by name. Viewers would purchase those exact supplies from Bob Ross Inc. The teaching certification program was genius. Ross trained instructors to teach his method at art centers worldwide. Each certified teacher paid licensing fees to Bob Ross Inc. and bought supplies exclusively from the company. By the late 1980s, Ross was earning millions annually, none of it from PBS. The Joy of Painting aired on 400 PBS stations, reaching millions of viewers. That audience fueled his supply business. The show was marketing, not a television career. Ross understood this perfectly, even if PBS audiences didn't realize they were watching elaborate product placement. Fact 12. Bob Ross almost never painted people or animals because he wasn't good at them and built his entire style around landscapes to hide this weakness.
How that's round on that corner. With that rounded corner to the top.
Bob Ross painted thousands of landscapes, but almost never included people or animals because he couldn't paint them well. This wasn't stylistic choice. It was strategic limitation management. Ross excelled at landscapes, trees, mountains, and water, using broad brushstrokes and palette knife techniques. But detailed figurative work, requiring precision, that was beyond his skill level. His injured finger made fine detail work difficult. His wet-on-wet technique wasn't suited for the detailed brushwork figurative painting requires. So, Ross built his entire brand around what he could paint easily. Occasionally, he'd add a tiny cabin or a simple bird silhouette. Never people, never detailed animals. Students would ask why he never painted portraits or wildlife. Ross would say he preferred nature untouched by humanity. It sounded philosophical. Really, it was covering his weakness. William Alexander, his teacher, could paint detailed figures. Ross couldn't match that skill, so he eliminated it entirely from his repertoire. The decision was brilliant. By focusing exclusively on landscapes, Ross mastered a narrow range and looked incredibly skilled within that limitation. He turned weakness into brand identity. The joy of painting succeeded because Ross understood his limitations and built everything around his strengths. Fact 11. Bob Ross died from lymphoma at age 52 and spent his final year fighting the Kowalskis. For control of his legacy while undergoing chemotherapy,
Teach people a form of art that anybody can do. This is art for anyone who's ever wanted to put a dream.
Bob Ross's final year was a nightmare of cancer treatment and legal warfare. In 1994, Ross was diagnosed with lymphoma, aggressive cancer requiring immediate chemotherapy. He was only 52 years old. Ross underwent brutal treatment while still trying to film episodes. His appearance changed dramatically. He lost weight, his energy faded, but he kept filming because he needed income for medical bills. Simultaneously, the Kowalskis moved to take complete control of Bob Ross Inc. They presented contracts for Ross to sign, transferring all rights to them. Ross realized too late he'd been betrayed. He wanted to fight, but was too sick. His lawyer advised that legal battle would take years and cost money Ross didn't have. The Kowalskis knew Ross was dying and pressured him relentlessly. Ross eventually signed everything away to avoid leaving his family buried in legal debt. He died July 4th, 1995, 52 years old, having lost his business and his name to the partners he'd trusted for over a decade. His final months were spent not painting happy little trees, but battling the people who'd built an empire on his gentle image while he suffered alone through chemotherapy. If these secrets are devastating you, hit that subscribe button because the next facts expose even darker truths. Fact 10. Steve Ross was trained by his father to take over the joy of painting, but the Kowalskis blacklisted him and prevented him from teaching.
Let's do a mountain. We're going to use a little bit of Van Dyke Brown, a little bit of Midnight Black.
Well, you can still see reruns of The Joy of Painting. The program originally aired on public television in the 1980s and 1990s.
Steve Ross was supposed to inherit his father's legacy. Instead, he was systematically destroyed by the Kowalskis. Bob Ross trained his son Steve in the wet-on-wet technique from childhood. Steve appeared in several Joy of Painting episodes, teaching alongside his father. Bob wanted Steve to eventually host his own painting show and carry on the family tradition. Steve was talented, charismatic, and shared his father's gentle teaching style. After Bob died in 1995, Steve expected to continue teaching and hosting. The Kowalskis had other plans. They owned the rights to Bob Ross's name and teaching method. Steve couldn't legally teach the technique without their permission. The Kowalskis denied him certification and threatened legal action if he taught independently. They didn't want competition. Bob Ross Inc. wanted to control the brand completely without family interference. Steve was blocked from the career his father had prepared him for his entire life. He struggled financially for decades, unable to use his own last name professionally. The Kowalskis built a billion-dollar empire from Bob Ross's legacy, while his son was legally prevented from painting publicly. Steve Ross finally began teaching again in 2015 after years of legal struggles. But by then, he'd lost 2 decades of his career to the Kowalskis' control. Fact 9. Bob Ross rarely smiled or laughed. In real life and friends, said the gentle persona was performance he couldn't maintain. Off camera,
Hello, I'm Bob Ross, and I'd like to welcome you to the 14th Joy of Painting series.
serious face versus gentle face. The Bob Ross everyone knows from television wasn't the Bob Ross his friends knew personally. People who spent time with Ross off camera said he was quiet, serious, and rarely laughed. The gentle whispering voice and constant positivity were performance reserved for filming. Ross suffered from depression throughout his adult life. The military years had left psychological scars. Losing his wife Jane to cancer in 1993 devastated him. Friends said Ross would sit silently for hours. He drank more than publicly known. The happy little trees persona required enormous energy to maintain. After filming sessions, Ross would retreat to his hotel room alone. He'd told friends performing positivity for the camera exhausted him emotionally. Every episode required him to suppress his real feelings and project manufactured joy. Ross wasn't fake. He genuinely wanted to help people find peace through painting, but maintaining that persona cost him personally. The man who told millions not to worry and to find happiness struggled with both constantly in his private life. His depression worsened as the Kowalskis' control over his business tightened. By his final years, Ross felt trapped by the gentle image he'd created, unable to express anger or sadness without destroying his brand. Fact 8. The Joy of Painting was filmed in marathon sessions where Bob Ross would complete 13 episodes in 3 days with almost no sleep.
Glad you could join me today. Today I thought we'd do a fantastic little painting maybe it's deep in the woods.
The filming schedule for The Joy of Painting was absolutely brutal and contributed to Ross's declining health. PBS budgets were tiny. The production company couldn't afford extended filming schedules. Solution: marathon filming sessions. Ross would travel to Muncie, Indiana, and film an entire season in one trip. 13 episodes per season, filmed over just 3 days. That's over 4 episodes daily. Each episode required complete setup, painting execution, and breakdown. Ross would finish one painting, immediately set up a fresh canvas, and begin the next episode. No rest, no breaks beyond brief minutes between episodes. By the 3rd day, Ross was painting on pure adrenaline and muscle memory. Friends said he'd be so exhausted after filming, he'd sleep for days recovering. The pace was unsustainable and physically damaging. Ross developed back problems from standing at the easel for 12+ hours daily. His hands developed tremors from repetitive motion without rest. But PBS schedules and budgets demanded this pace. Ross never complained publicly. He viewed it as necessary sacrifice to keep the show accessible and free for viewers. The gentle paintings were created under extreme physical and mental stress nobody watching could have imagined. Fact 7. Bob Ross's first wife, Jane, died of cancer in 1993, and he remarried within months, which his family felt was disrespectful. Bob Ross and wife Bob Ross's personal life, after his first wife Jane's death, created family turmoil nobody discussed publicly. Jane Ross died from cancer in August 1993 after 26 years of marriage. Ross was devastated. Jane had been his partner since before the military. She'd supported him through career transitions and the launch of The Joy of Painting. Her death broke something in Ross. Friends said he seemed lost without her. Then, just months later in 1994, Ross remarried a woman named Linda Brown. The quick remarriage shocked his family and friends. Ross's son Steve felt his mother's memory was being disrespected. The new marriage was troubled from the start. Some believed Linda married Ross, knowing he was wealthy and potentially dying from cancer. Ross's lymphoma diagnosis came shortly after the wedding. Linda became his caretaker during treatment, but their relationship was reportedly cold and transactional. Ross's family suspected she was positioning herself to inherit his estate. After Ross died in 1995, Linda did receive portions of his estate, but the Kowalskis had already seized control of Bob Ross Inc., so there was little left. The rushed second marriage created permanent family rifts and added emotional chaos to Ross's final years, already filled with cancer treatment and business betrayal. Fact 6. PBS stations received The Joy of Painting for free, but made millions from fundraising using Bob Ross's paintings as pledge drive incentives.
More than 30 years after his death, the work of artist, educator, and public television icon Bob Ross.
The first 3 of 30 Bob Ross paintings go up for auction Tuesday.
PBS stations exploited Bob Ross's generosity in ways that enriched them, while Ross received nothing. The Joy of Painting was provided to PBS stations completely free. Ross covered all production costs through Bob Ross Inc. PBS paid him nothing. Stations could air episodes as often as they wanted. In return, Ross got exposure for his supply business. But PBS stations found another revenue stream. During fundraising drives, they'd offer Bob Ross's original paintings as incentives for large donations. Donate $1,000, receive an original Bob Ross. The paintings Ross had donated freely to PBS stations were being used to generate millions in pledge drive donations. Ross gave away hundreds of paintings to PBS specifically for this purpose. He believed in public broadcasting and wanted to support it, but PBS stations were making enormous profits from his donated art, while he remained unpaid for the show itself. Some stations made over $100,000 annually from Ross-related fundraising. The math was staggering. Ross donated free content, free paintings, and received zero compensation, while PBS stations built significant revenue streams from his work. He knew but never complained. His belief in accessible art education outweighed financial considerations. PBS's exploitation of his generosity remains one of the uncomfortable truths about public broadcasting economics. Fact 5. Bob Ross's signature. Phrases like "happy little trees" were initially mocked by art critics who dismissed him as a hack before his posthumous rehabilitation. During his lifetime, the fine art world absolutely despised Bob Ross and everything he represented. Art critics called him a hack, a fraud, and an insult to legitimate painters. His cheerful demeanor and accessible technique were treated as jokes by the art establishment. Galleries refused to show his work. Art schools mocked his wet-on-wet technique as shortcuts for people with no real talent. The phrase "happy little trees" became shorthand in art circles for everything wrong with commercialized painting. Critics wrote that Ross produced decorative wall art, not real art. They accused him of dumbing down painting and creating an army of amateurs churning out identical landscapes. Ross was aware of the criticism. It hurt him, despite his gentle public persona. He'd tell friends he wasn't trying to create museum-quality art. He wanted to help people find joy and relaxation through creativity. The art world's rejection bothered him more than he ever admitted. Then Ross died in 1995. Slowly, opinions shifted. New generations discovered the joy of painting through reruns and later YouTube. Suddenly, Ross was cool, ironically cool, then genuinely appreciated. Artists began crediting Ross as an influence. Museums started exhibiting his work. The same art critics who dismissed him scrambled to write retrospectives praising his accessibility and therapeutic approach to painting. The rehabilitation was complete. Fact 4. Bob Ross painted the same mountain in different variations over 300 times, and viewers never realized they were watching. Essentially the same painting repeatedly.
And the proceeds will benefit public television stations across the country that have been struggling with the recent loss of government funding.
Hi, I'm glad you could join me today. Today we're going to do a wonderful little painting, and I really think you're going to enjoy this.
Bob Ross had a secret formula. He painted slight variations of the same basic composition hundreds of times, and nobody noticed. His landscapes followed predictable patterns: background mountain, middle ground tree line, foreground water or meadow, small cabin or waterfall for interest. The mountains were always painted identically using the same palette knife technique. Trees followed the same fan brush method. Water used identical horizontal strokes. Ross wasn't hiding this. He openly taught these formulas, but viewers didn't realize how repetitive the episodes actually were. Of 403 Joy of Painting episodes, over 300 featured essentially the same mountain with minor variations. Same technique, same colors, same composition, just different arrangements. Ross knew exactly what he was doing. The repetition wasn't laziness, it was teaching methodology. By showing the same mountain hundreds of times with slight variations, Ross was drilling the technique into viewers' minds. Repetition builds skill. After watching 50 episodes of the same mountain, viewers internalized the technique subconsciously. When they tried painting themselves, their hands remembered. Ross's repetitive formula was brilliant pedagogy, disguised as variety. He understood that learning requires seeing the same thing done many times before comprehension solidifies. The lack of variety wasn't weakness. It was educational genius. Fact 3. Bob Ross's afro was so damaged from years of perming that his natural hair fell out and he wore a wig during final episodes.
Welcome back. I'm glad to see you again. I thought today I'd show you, when you learn to paint.
Ross. The afro that defined Bob Ross literally destroyed his hair. Decades of chemical perms ravaged his scalp. By the early 1990s, Ross's natural hair was falling out in patches. Chemical burns from repeated perming treatments caused permanent damage to hair follicles. Ross developed bald spots he desperately tried to hide. The perm couldn't take hold anymore because there wasn't enough healthy hair. Hairstylists told him to stop perming immediately and let his hair recover. But Ross couldn't. The afro was his brand. Without it, he wasn't Bob Ross. So he made the devastating decision to wear a wig. Starting around 1993, the afro viewers saw on The Joy of Painting was fake. Ross hated the wig even more than he'd hated the perm. It was hot, uncomfortable, and felt like a costume. Friends said wearing the wig depressed him severely. It was a physical symbol of being trapped by his own image. The man underneath wanted to shave his head completely. The brand demanded the afro. During his cancer treatment in 1994, Ross's remaining natural hair fell out from chemotherapy. The wig became even more necessary. In his final episodes, dying from cancer, Ross wore a synthetic afro wig, painting happy little trees, while everything inside him was breaking down. Fact 2. The Kowalskis launched a lawsuit against Ross's family. After his death, claiming they owned his name and the family lost everything in court. Legal publication. Bob Ross children. After Bob Ross died, the Kowalskis went to war against his family to eliminate any claims to his legacy. Ross's son Steve, his brother, and surviving relatives believed they had some rights to Bob's name and image. They were wrong. The Kowalskis had meticulously constructed legal documents giving Bob Ross Inc. complete ownership. In 1996, the Kowalskis filed lawsuits against Ross's family members, who attempted to use Bob's name or teach his method. The family couldn't afford legal defense. They settled, signing away any future claims. Steve Ross was specifically targeted. The Kowalskis sued him repeatedly, forcing him into bankruptcy. Every time Steve tried to teach painting or reference his father publicly, the Kowalskis threatened legal action. The family was crushed emotionally and financially. They had watched the Kowalskis manipulate Bob in his final days, extracting signatures while he was dying. Now they watched helplessly as the Kowalskis built a billion-dollar empire from Bob's gentle image. Netflix's 2021 documentary Bob Ross: Happy Accidents, Betrayal, and Greed exposed the Kowalskis' tactics publicly for the first time. The documentary sparked outrage. People finally understood that Bob Ross's family had been systematically destroyed by the business partners Bob had trusted. The Kowalskis continue to control Bob Ross Inc. and have never apologized or offered restitution to the family they devastated. Fact 1. Bob Ross wanted the joy of painting to end after his death, but the Kowalskis have kept it running and profited for decades against his wishes.
Filled with people learning to paint, just like Bob Ross. They'll do 5 hours in these seats with a 45-minute lunch break.
Yellow and bright red. There, just load a little bit on the brush. Let's go right up here. Maybe we'll have a sun.
Bob Ross explicitly stated he wanted the joy of painting to end when he died. He believed the show was personal and shouldn't continue without him. The Kowalskis ignored his wishes completely. After Ross died in July 1995, Bob Ross Inc. kept the show in syndication. They licensed it to streaming services, Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, every platform. The show Ross wanted to end has been running continuously for 30 years after his death. The Kowalskis discovered streaming rights in the 2000s were worth millions. Young audiences discovered Ross through YouTube. Entire new generations watched The Joy of Painting. Merchandise exploded. Bob Ross t-shirts, bobbleheads, chia pets, energy drinks. Everything profitable, everything against what Ross would have wanted. He'd given paintings away free his entire life. The Kowalskis turned his image into a billion-dollar merchandising empire. Ross believed art should be accessible and uncommercial. The Kowalskis made him the most commercialized painter in history. Ross's family receives nothing from streaming rights, merchandise, or licensing deals. The Kowalskis own everything. Bob Ross wanted to be remembered as a teacher who helped people find peace. Instead, he's a brand, a logo, a product. The gentle painter is now an energy drink, a chia pet, a Halloween costume. The joy of painting he created with love has become the joy of profiting, and there's nothing his family can do to stop it. Bonus fact: Bob Ross completed his final painting just days before his death, and it was a dark, stormy landscape, completely unlike his usual work.
Welcome back. I'm certainly glad you could join us today. Today is the last show of the 31st series.
Bob Ross. Bob Ross's final painting was nothing like the happy little trees he'd painted for decades. In late June 1995, days before his death, Ross asked for his painting supplies to be brought to his hospice room. He was too weak to stand at an easel. Friends positioned a small canvas on a table beside his bed. Ross painted lying in bed, barely able to hold brushes. The painting was dark, storm clouds, no happy trees, no sunlight, just turbulent skies and shadows. Friends watching said Ross seemed to be painting his own death. It was farewell through art. The painting took him hours to complete, working in brief moments between exhaustion. He finished it July 2nd. 2 days later, July 4th, 1995, Bob Ross died. The final painting was given to Annette Kowalski. She locked it away. Bob Ross Inc. has never shown it publicly. Steve Ross has requested to see his father's final work. The Kowalskis refused. The painting remains hidden, locked in storage somewhere. Bob Ross's last artistic statement lost to the world, because the people who control his legacy won't share it. His final message, whatever it was, remains unseen. The joy of painting wasn't just happy little trees and soothing voices. It was exploitation, betrayal, and one gentle man crushed by the empire built on his kindness. If these secrets devastated you, hit that like button, smash subscribe, and tell me in the comments which fact broke your heart. Thanks for watching, and remember, we don't make mistakes in business, just betrayals,